I spent 60 years believing a part of me had died, only to discover that my daughter had been alive all along. The truth shattered me and saved me in the same breath, pulling me into a journey I never thought I'd survive. This is the story of how I found her and how I finally found myself. When I look back on the beginning of my story, I still feel the weight of that morning pressing against my chest as if it happened only moments ago, even though I am 60 years old and have lived through more seasons than I ever expected to survive, and each one has left its mark on me in ways I never learned to fully name. I remember waking to the weak light slipping through the curtains and thinking it would be another slow day filled with familiar aches in my knees and that steady loneliness that settles into a home when children grow up or disappear completely, and a woman finds herself listening more to silence than to voices. I had accepted that quiet as the rhythm of my life until the phone rang and the sound startled me. Not because it was loud, but because calls had become rare for me, and I had grown used to hearing from almost no one. I answered with the calm I have learned to wear like a habit, and the man on the other end spoke with hesitation, as if choosing every word with care, which immediately made my breath tighten. He asked my name, and when I told him I was Elena Hart, and confirmed again that I was indeed 60 years old, he exhaled in a way that made me sit up straighter. I could feel my heart picking up its pace, like an old machine forced to run faster than it should. He told me he had information about something from my past, and when I asked what he meant, a strange buzzing filled my ears, and I pressed the phone closer, even though I already sensed the earth shifting under me. He said there had been an error many years ago, and that the child I believed had passed after birth might not have died. He said he had documents that suggested my daughter had been alive and taken somewhere else, and that new records had come forward, only now revealing a truth that had been hidden for decades. I felt every part of me freeze, and for a moment I could not speak. I remember staring at the wall in front of me, seeing nothing but the blur of paint and the faint outline of my reflection in the glass frame hanging next to it. And I remember thinking that my mind must be tricking me, because grief that old does not simply unravel after 40 years. I had buried that pain so deep that I learned to walk around it like broken glass scattered on a floor. Yet, in a single breath, everything I had taught myself to accept began to crumble. I asked him to explain, but he did not know more, and only repeated that the truth was coming to light after someone came forward with details that matched my history. I felt a trembling spread through my hands, and I gripped the arm of the chair to steady myself as memories I had locked away started rushing back. The soft newborn cry, that never came. The cold room, where I was told not to look when they covered her. The way the nurse placed her hand on my shoulder with a softness meant to comfort, but felt like a closing door. I had trusted them because I was young and scared and alone, and because everyone told me loss happens and that life moves on. But life never moved on for me. Not really. It just grew heavier in quieter ways. And now this man was telling me that the center of my grief might have been built on a lie. I thanked him with a voice I barely recognized and hung up. Then I sat in that same spot for what felt like hours, though it might have been minutes, my mind circling through disbelief, hope, confusion, anger, and a longing so sharp it felt like someone was pulling threads from the deepest part of me. I tried to breathe, but each breath became uneven, and I pressed my hand against my chest as if I could hold myself together. My house around me felt different, suddenly, too small to contain the weight of this new truth and too silent to carry the sound of everything breaking open inside me. I kept whispering to myself that this could not be real, that I must have misheard him. Yet a part of me, the part that had never truly healed, felt something warm and frightening rise like the first spark of hope. I stood up slowly, sensing my legs wobble under me, and I walked to the mirror above the dresser. I stared at my reflection, the silver strands in my hair, the softness around my eyes, the shape of a woman who had lived through disappointment after disappointment, but had never stopped loving a child she never got to hold. I looked at myself as if seeing a stranger, but also as if recognizing someone I had not met in years, someone who once believed in miracles. I whispered my name again, as if reminding myself that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of beginning a journey I never dared to imagine. And in that moment, I felt a shift deep in my chest, a quiet promise forming. I did not know where my daughter was, or what kind of life she had lived, or whether she would ever want to meet me, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had to try to find her, even if every road ahead of me was uncertain, even if every step hurt, even if the truth waiting for me was more painful than the lie I had lived with for decades. Something inside me had awakened, and I could not let it go. I stood there with my hand against the cool edge of the dresser and whispered the only words that made sense. I am coming for you, my child. Wherever you are, I am coming. I spent the rest of that day moving through my home like someone wandering inside a dream, where every familiar detail feels slightly altered, as if the world is waiting for me to notice something I missed before. And I remember touching the back of each chair and the edge of each doorway, as if grounding myself in the present could keep my heart from drifting into the storm of memories rising inside me. But nothing steadied me completely, because my mind kept circling back to the same impossible truth that my daughter might be alive. And the more I repeated those words in my head, the more real they became, until I could almost feel the old ache inside me transforming into something sharp and urgent and alive. Something that felt like hope, even though I tried not to name it that quickly, since hope can be both a lifeline and a knife if held the wrong way. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling beside me untouched, and watched the steam fade into the air because it reminded me of how I used to sit in this same spot years ago, imagining what my life might have been like if my baby had lived, wondering what her first word would have been, how her tiny hands would have felt wrapped around my finger, and how different I might have become if I had been allowed to be her mother beyond those first fragile moments that were taken from me before I understood what was happening. I felt the weight of those lost years press against my ribs, but instead of collapsing under it the way I once did, I felt a strange strength rising from somewhere deep inside me, a strength that made me push my chair back and stand up with a certainty I had not felt in years. I went to my small desk in the corner of the living room where I kept old papers tucked away in folders that had not been opened in decades. Papers I had avoided because they carried memories I had forced myself to bury so I could survive the life that followed. My fingers shook as I reached for them because I already knew each page inside held fragments of a past I had spent years trying not to revisit. But now those fragments felt like clues in a story that had been rewritten without my consent. I pulled out the thin envelope that held the hospital records I had been given all those years ago. And even though the paper had yellowed with time, the words written on it still felt as sharp as they did the day I received them. I read them slowly, searching for anything that might hint at what had really happened. Anything that might explain why someone would tell a young mother her child had died when she had not. My eyes stopped on the name of a nurse I vaguely remembered, a woman who rarely looked me in the eyes and always seemed hurried, and I felt a cold shiver run through me as if I had stumbled over a thread I was meant to follow. I placed the paper on the table and leaned forward with my elbows resting on the wood, thinking hard about what my next step should be. For years, I had avoided asking questions because I believed that reopening wounds from the past would only break me further. But now I realized that not asking had cost me far more. I exhaled slowly and whispered to myself that I had the right to know what happened to my own child. And the moment I said it aloud, I felt something inside me settle into place, as if the truth itself had been waiting for me to claim it. I picked up my phone with hands that still trembled and searched for information about the people who had been involved in my case back then. And even though I doubted I would find much given how much time had passed, I was surprised to see a familiar name appear in a small listing for a care facility not far from where I lived. The nurse I remembered was still alive, older now, but still working in a limited capacity according to the brief description. My heart thudded hard as I stared at her name glowing on the screen, and for a moment, I felt like that young woman again who had stood in a hospital room with empty arms and a hollow soul. But instead of collapsing under the memory, I stood taller because now I had a purpose that went beyond my grief. I wrote down the address, even though I had already memorized it, and then folded the paper neatly, as if preparing myself for a journey that stretched far beyond the physical miles I would need to travel. I walked to the mirror again, not out of vanity, but because I needed to see the woman who was about to reclaim a story she never agreed to lose. And I stared into my own eyes until I recognized the flicker of determination shining there, the same spark I once carried when I believed the world still held room for miracle. I whispered that I was ready, even though every part of me trembled with uncertainty. And then I gathered my bag, my papers, and my courage, as if they were pieces of armor I would need for what lay ahead. As I stood in the doorway of my home, I paused for a moment and looked back at the quiet rooms behind me, rooms that had witnessed my loneliness and my healing and the slow fading of my hope. And I felt a swell of emotion rise in my throat because I knew that when I returned, nothing about my life would feel the same again. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, and with my hand still resting on the handle, I whispered to myself that the search had begun. Not because I wanted to chase the past, but because the past had finally reached for me, and I owed it to my daughter and to myself to follow wherever it led. I barely slept the night before I planned to visit the care facility because my mind kept replaying every detail of the phone call and every memory I had pushed aside for decades. And each time I closed my eyes, I saw the faint outline of a newborn I never got to hold long enough to memorize. So I lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of my small house as if it were trying to soothe me, but nothing eased the restless mix of fear and longing turning inside me. And by the time the first light of morning touched the ceiling, I felt both exhausted and strangely awake, as if anticipation alone were keeping me steady. I moved through my routine slowly, choosing clothes that made me feel grounded and brushing my hair with more care than usual because I wanted to walk into that place strong, not like a woman defined by her losses, but like a mother determined to reclaim what had been stolen from her. And while I knew appearances meant little compared to the truth, was seeking. Preparing myself gave me a sense of control over a day that felt too big for my trembling hands. I made a cup of tea but barely tasted it, because my mind kept drifting to the questions I had rehearsed in the darkness of the night. Questions that felt fragile, yet necessary. And I repeated them under my breath to steady my voice, since I knew that the moment I faced the woman who might know what happened, I could easily fall apart if I was not careful. I gathered the old documents and tucked them into my bag with the same care someone might use when packing precious belongings. And before I stepped out, I paused in front of the mirror again, meeting my own reflection, as if I needed one more quiet promise to myself. And I whispered that no matter how painful the truth might be, I was strong enough to hear it now, because time had changed me in ways grief never could. The drive felt longer than it was because every road I passed seemed to stretch into my past, each street sign reminding me of something I once believed or dreamed or lost. And by the time I reached the facility, my heart was pounding so hard I pressed my hand against my chest as if trying to calm it through touch alone. The building looked ordinary and worn from years of use, but to me, it felt like a doorway into the part of my life I had been denied. And for a moment, I hesitated near the entrance, wondering if I had enough courage to face whatever waited inside. I closed my eyes, took a slow breath, and reminded myself that fear was only a companion and not a master. Then pulled open the door and stepped into a foyer filled with soft voices and the faint scent of disinfectant mixed with something warm, like freshly brewed coffee. I told the receptionist I was looking for a woman named Marin, and when she nodded and said she worked in one of the back offices, my stomach tightened because hearing her name spoken aloud made everything feel painfully real. As I waited for someone to guide me down the hall, I felt a strange mixture of dread and hope swirling in my veins, like two currents fighting for control. And when a young employee appeared and gestured for me to follow, my legs felt heavier with each step, even as my resolve sharpened. The hallway was quiet except for the distant sound of soft conversation, and the muted lights overhead cast a gentle glow that made everything feel slower, as if time itself had decided to match the pace of the lives lived here. When the employee stopped in front of a small office with a glass panel in the door and told me she was inside, my breath caught, and for a moment, I felt the room tilt slightly, as though the weight of 40 years had just leaned against me. But I steadied myself by placing a hand on the wall and whispering that I was ready, even if I did not feel ready at all. He opened the door for me, and I stepped inside to see an older woman sitting at a desk cluttered with files, her gray hair pulled into a neat twist and her glasses balanced low on her nose as she read a paper with deep focus. When she looked up and saw me, her expression shifted from surprise to a kind of cautious recognition, and I watched her eyes study me as if searching for something familiar in the shape of my face. I introduced myself and told her why I had come, and the moment I spoke my daughter's birth year aloud, something flickered across her face, something like guilt mixed with fear, and that tiny change sliced through me like a blade. My voice trembled as I asked if she remembered my case, and she leaned back slowly as if bracing herself before answering. And when she said my name softly, as though trying to pull it from a distant memory, I felt a swell of emotion rise in my throat so quickly I had to close my eyes for a moment. She told me she remembered fragments because there were complications that night and many staff members involved. But she remembered the unease among the team and the way information was passed quietly instead of openly. And hearing her say that made my skin prickle because it confirmed what I had always felt deep down, that something had never been right about the way they handled my loss. I told her about the recent call and how I learned my daughter might have been alive, and her hands trembled slightly as she folded them on the desk. And after a long silence, she admitted that there were rumors that some newborns were relocated under the claim of medical necessity or adoption arrangements that were never fully explained to the mothers. My breath froze because the words felt too close to the truth I feared, and I felt tears sting my eyes, even as I tried to keep my voice steady while asking her if she believed my child had been taken. She did not answer immediately, but the sadness in her eyes spoke louder than any denial could. And when she finally whispered that she always suspected something had been kept from me that night, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet in a way that was both devastating and clarifying. I sat in silence for a long moment, letting the truth settle into my bones, and as painful as it was, something inside me hardened with resolve, because now I had confirmation that my search was not born from imagination or grief, but from a truth others had tried to bury. When I finally stood to leave, she reached out and touched my hand gently, her voice barely above a whisper, as she told me she hoped I would find my daughter and that she was sorry for the part she played in my pain, even if she never understood the full story herself. I walked out of that office feeling both shattered and rebuilt, as if the woman who entered was not the same woman who stepped back into the hallway. And as I moved toward the exit, I felt the air around me shift with a new certainty that my daughter was out there somewhere and that I was closer to her now than I had ever been. I stepped outside the building with my heart pounding so loudly I could feel the rhythm in my fingertips, and for a moment I just stood there, breathing in the warm air as if my lungs needed time to learn how to work again after everything I had just heard. And while the world around me moved at its usual pace, with people walking by and a car humming in the distance, It all felt strangely muted to me, as if some invisible curtain had dropped between my inner turmoil and the ordinary life unfolding around me. I walked slowly toward my car, each step feeling heavier than the last, because the truth Marin hinted at echoed inside me with every movement. And even though she had not said the words outright, her expression told me more than I expected to hear that day, and left me feeling as though I had touched the edge of a wound that had been waiting to open for decades. When I reached my car, I sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, while the memories I had tried to bury fought their way back to the surface. And I kept seeing flashes of the room where I gave birth, the harsh light above me, the quiet panic in the staff around me, and that cold stillness after they told me my daughter had not survived. And the more I let myself remember, the more the story I had been given back then crumbled under its own weight. I thought about the years I spent believing that grief was the price of being human, that heartbreak simply became the background of a woman's life as she aged. But now I realized I had been mourning a lie, and that realization hit me with a force so sharp I pressed my hand against my chest to steady my breath. I started the engine and drove slowly, not because of traffic, but because my mind was drifting between the lines of past and present, and each mile seemed to peel back layers I had not touched in years, revealing fears and hopes I had never fully let go of. As the road unfolded before me, I felt a quiet determination settle into my bones, something steadier than anger and deeper than suspicion, something like a mother's instinct waking after sleeping far too long. And I knew I could not stop now, even if every step of this journey felt like walking barefoot over broken pieces of my own history. When I reached my home, I walked inside as if entering a place that no longer entirely belonged to me, because everything looked too familiar and yet carried a different meaning now, each object holding a version of me that had lived in a story built by someone else's choices. I placed my bag on the kitchen table and spread out the documents again, letting my fingers trace the lines of old handwriting and faded ink. And I felt a sharp ache in my chest as I whispered my daughter's birth date, letting the sound linger in the quiet room like a fragile reminder that she was real, alive somewhere, and no longer just a memory wrapped in sorrow. I sat down and forced myself to think clearly, because I knew that emotional storming without direction would only slow me down. So I made a list of everything I needed to do, every person I needed to find, and every record I needed to uncover. And with each step I wrote, the path ahead became clearer, even if parts of it frightened me. I realized I needed to find adoption records, medical transfers, any filing that might show where my daughter had been taken. And even though the thought of navigating those systems made me feel like an older woman lost in a maze designed for people younger and faster, I reminded myself that determination can outlast youth when the heart is driven by love. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, imagining my daughter as an adult, wondering if she had children of her own, wondering if she ever felt an emptiness she could not explain, an emptiness that might be the echo of a connection cut too early. The thought made my throat tighten, and I let myself cry quietly, not with despair, but with a strange mix of grief and hope woven so tightly together I could not pull them apart. After a long while, I wiped my face and stood up, feeling steadier as if the tears had cleared a path forward inside me. I walked around my house slowly, touching the edges of picture frames and shelves the way someone might prepare a home before a long journey, and my mind kept drifting to the possibility of meeting her, of standing face to face with the life I had been denied. I imagined hearing her voice for the first time, imagined her eyes searching mine with the same cautious wonder I would surely feel. And the image overwhelmed me so deeply that I had to sit on the edge of my bed to catch my breath. I whispered her name again, even though I did not know what name she had grown up with, and I felt a small tremor in my chest, as if saying it aloud created a bridge between us, a fragile connection stretching across years and distance. I told myself that she might not want to meet me, that she might reject the idea of a woman who lost her not by choice, but by deception. Yet even that painful possibility did not change my resolve, because love is not a contract requiring reciprocation. It is a promise a mother makes long before she knows the shape of her child's future. I took out a journal I had not written in for years and opened to a blank page, feeling the quiet intimacy of starting fresh. And I wrote her a letter, not to send, but to steady myself, telling her who I was beyond the grief, telling her what I hoped to give if she ever allowed me into her life. And as I wrote, my hand shook, but my heart settled in a way it had not in decades. When I finished, I closed the journal gently and placed it on my nightstand, whispering that this search was no longer just about uncovering the past, but about reclaiming a future that had been stolen from us both. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the soft light fading across the sky, feeling the weight of the moment settle in my bones. And as I gazed into the distance, I understood that the journey ahead would change everything about my life, and I felt ready, or at least ready enough to take the next step toward the daughter I had never stopped loving. I woke the next morning feeling a strange mixture of heaviness and clarity, as if the night had sifted through all the tangled pieces inside me and left only the ones I needed to move forward. And for a long moment, I lay there, staring at the ceiling while the early light stretched across the room in soft lines that made everything look quieter than it felt in my chest. I could sense my heartbeat pulsing against the mattress in a slow, steady rhythm that did not match the restless thoughts gathering in my mind. And when I finally sat up, I felt the familiar stiffness in my joints remind me of my age, even as something younger and fiercer stirred beneath it. I walked to the bathroom and splashed water on my face, watching droplets slide down my cheeks like echoes of the tears I had shed the night before. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw a woman who had lived through enough pain to break her several times. Yet somehow, she still held herself together with a quiet determination that seemed to grow stronger with every truth she uncovered. As I stood there, I thought about my daughter again, imagining her waking up somewhere in the world without any idea that her mother had rediscovered the trail leading back to her. And the thought made me feel both protective and achingly vulnerable, as if I were carrying something delicate in hands that trembled slightly. I moved to the kitchen and made myself a simple breakfast, though I barely tasted it because my mind kept drifting to the next steps I needed to take. And I realized that finding adoption or transfer records might require help from someone who knew how to navigate systems that had changed drastically over the years. I considered reaching out to a friend or even a community office, but something inside me resisted the idea of involving others too early. Not out of distrust, but because I felt this search belonged to me before it belonged to anyone else, at least until I had enough information to decide how much I was willing to expose. I sat at my table with my notebook open, tapping my pen lightly as I organized my thoughts, and I wrote down everything I had learned so far, allowing the words to anchor me in a process that felt too large to hold in my mind alone. When I finished, I closed the notebook and rested my palms against its cover, feeling the faint texture of the paper beneath my skin, and telling myself that small steps were still progress, even if the distance ahead felt overwhelming. I stood and walked to the living room, drawn toward a box I had kept tucked away in the back of a cabinet for years. A box filled with items from the part of my life I rarely let myself revisit. And as I pulled it out, dust drifted into the air like tiny memories unsettled from their long sleep. I opened the lid slowly, feeling my breath catch when I saw the small baby blanket I had kept, even though I never had the chance to wrap her in it. And I ran my fingers over the soft fabric, imagining the warmth of her tiny body pressed against me, imagining the life we could have shared if that night had gone differently. I held the blanket against my chest and let myself cry again, not with the hopelessness I once carried, but with a deeper, more determined sorrow that reminded me why I could not give up now. And when I finally placed it back into the box, I did so gently, as if promising her that I would not let her story fade again. I spent the next few hours searching through old papers, letters, and keepsakes, hoping something inside them would point me in a clearer direction. And though I did not find anything concrete, the process itself awakened memories that sharpened my intuition, making me more certain that the truth had always been near, but hidden by people who believed they had the right to decide the fate of a young woman and her child. I walked to the window and watched a few leaves drift across the yard as a breeze moved through the trees, and I felt a quiet steadiness rise inside me, the kind of steadiness that comes from finally choosing to face what once frightened you. I whispered softly to myself that I was not the same woman I had been at 20, nor the woman who spent years accepting silence as the final answer. And as I leaned against the frame, I felt something inside me unlock. A shift that told me I was ready for the next stage of this search, even if it meant stepping into places where old pain would surface again. I took my bag from the table, placed my notebook inside it, and added the documents from the hospital because I knew they would be important for future conversations. And as I zipped the bag closed, I felt a sense of purpose settle into my bones, like a quiet flame that would not go out. I walked to the door and paused with my hand on the knob, letting the moment stretch long enough for me to gather my courage. And then I stepped outside with a steady breath, feeling the weight of the day press against me, but not enough to hold me back. I locked the door behind me and whispered to myself that every answer I uncovered from this point on would bring me closer to the daughter who had lived in my heart for 40 years. And as I walked toward my car with the sun warming my shoulders, I felt a fragile but powerful truth settle inside me, a truth I carried like a promise. I was no longer searching out of desperation or fear, but out of love. And love, I reminded myself, has a way of guiding even the most uncertain steps through the darkest paths. I drove across town with a tension in my shoulders that felt like a long thread slowly tightening as the traffic crawled forward, and the day stretched into a muted blur of movement and noise. And even though my hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, I could feel the tremor of anticipation running through me like a current I could not shut off. The sky hung low with a soft grayness that made everything look slightly washed out, and the air carried a damp chill that crept through the cracks of the car, turning my breath into a thin mist each time I exhaled. I tried to focus on the road, yet my mind kept circling around the same questions I had asked myself for years about where she might be, what kind of childhood she had lived, and whether she had ever felt the quiet ache of wondering where she came from. I felt a sharp twist in my chest when I realized that somewhere out there, she might have spent her entire life believing I had forgotten her, and the thought made my vision blur for a moment until I blinked hard and forced myself to breathe through the sudden wave of guilt that rose like a tide inside my throat. I reminded myself that I had been young, frightened, and alone, and though those truths did not erase the pain of what happened, they helped me understand the girl I had been and the choices she was pushed into. Choices she did not fully grasp until the weight of them settled on her years later like a permanent shadow. I pulled into the small parking lot outside the building where I hoped to get more information. A government office tucked between a pharmacy and a quiet cafe that smelled faintly of roasted beans every time the door opened. And I sat there for a moment with the engine off, feeling the stillness inside the car settle over me like a thin blanket. My heart tapped steadily against my ribs as I gathered my documents and placed them neatly in my bag, my fingers brushing the edges as if touching something fragile that needed to be handled with care. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror before stepping out, noticing the slight redness around my eyes, and I took a steadying breath while telling myself that whatever happened inside those walls would be another step forward, even if it left me with more questions than answers. When I walked into the lobby, a wave of warm air washed over me and carried the faint smell of cleaning supplies mixed with paper and ink, the kind of scent that always reminded me of waiting rooms where people sat with nervous hands and hopeful hearts. I approached the front desk, where a woman with gentle eyes greeted me with a polite smile that felt surprisingly comforting, and I explained that I was looking for records from several decades ago regarding a newborn who had been transferred out of a hospital under unclear circumstances. Her expression shifted to something softer, something that suggested she understood more than she let on, and she handed me a form to fill out, along with instructions spoken in a calm, steady voice that helped ground me in the moment. I sat in a chair near the window and filled out the form carefully, pausing several times as memories surfaced that made my hand tremble slightly while I wrote. But I forced myself to continue, because stopping now felt like abandoning her all over again. When I returned the completed form, the woman told me it could take days, possibly weeks, to locate anything from that far back, assuming those records still existed at all. And though the disappointment hit me like a sudden cold wind, I thanked her sincerely, because even the possibility of progress felt like something meaningful. As I walked outside, the air felt even heavier than before, and a faint drizzle had begun to fall, coating the pavement in a thin reflective sheen that made the world look slightly blurred. I stood under the awning for a moment, watching the rain gather into small streams that trickled toward the street, and I pressed my hand against my bag, as if reassuring myself that the documents inside it were safe. I walked to the cafe next door and stepped inside, grateful for the warmth that greeted me and for the quiet hum of conversation that made the space feel alive in a gentle, soothing way. I ordered a cup of tea and chose a seat near the window where I could watch the rain continue its steady descent, each drop tapping softly against the glass like a quiet reminder of the time passing. As I cupped my hands around the warm mug, I felt the heat seep into my palms and travel slowly up my arms, easing some of the tightness that had gathered in my body throughout the day. I let myself breathe deeply and allowed my thoughts to soften for a moment, imagining her as a little girl with curious eyes and soft hair, picturing her first steps, her first words, the first time she laughed, and all the small moments I never had the chance to witness. The ache that rose in my chest felt sharp, but not crushing, and I realized that grief sometimes shifts in form, becoming something quieter that guides you rather than suffocates you. When I finished my tea, I gathered my things and stepped back into the street where the rain had eased to a light drizzle, and I walked slowly toward my car with the steady awareness that nothing about this journey would come easily. Yet beneath the uncertainty, there was a quiet strength building inside me, a strength I had not felt in years. And as I unlocked the door and sat behind the wheel, I whispered to myself that I would keep going, no matter how long it took or how difficult each step became. I placed my hands on the steering wheel and closed my eyes for a brief moment, feeling the weight of the day settle across my shoulders like a shawl I knew I had to carry. And when I opened my eyes again, I felt a renewed sense of purpose flicker inside me. I started the engine and pulled onto the road, letting the soft hum of the car steady my breath as the rain continued to fall in delicate streaks across the windshield. I drove home slowly, with the quiet understanding that my life had shifted again, not outwardly, but inwardly, and the path ahead, though uncertain, felt like one I had been preparing myself to walk for decades. I woke the next morning with a restless energy moving through me, as if my body had been waiting all night for the moment my eyes opened. And for a few seconds I lay still, trying to piece together the swirling thoughts that had followed me into sleep and tugged me awake again before dawn. The room felt cool and quiet, and the faint light pressing through the curtains painted a soft glow across the walls that made everything look slightly muted, almost dreamy. Yet my mind was already racing ahead, as if reminding me that the day would not pause simply because I felt unsteady. I sat up slowly and let my feet rest on the floor, where the cool wood sent a small shiver through me, and I took a moment to steady my breathing before I pushed myself to stand. My reflection in the mirror caught my eye as I made my way toward the bathroom, and I paused, studying the woman staring back at me, with lines that carried years of worry, strength, and questions she had never stopped asking. I felt a sudden heaviness in my chest when I realized how much time had passed since I last allowed myself to hope for something this deeply, and I raised a hand to my cheek, feeling the faint warmth beneath my fingertips as if reminding myself that I was still here and still moving forward, even when the path felt uncertain. I showered and dressed with slow, deliberate movements, as if my body needed the familiar rhythm to hold me steady. And once I was ready, I made myself a simple breakfast that I barely tasted, because my thoughts kept drifting to the possibility that the office might call today with an update. The idea filled me with equal parts fear and anticipation, and I could feel my heart tighten each time I imagined hearing the phone ring. After cleaning the dishes, I carried my mug of warm tea into the living room and sat on the couch where the morning light reached me through the window, creating a small bright patch across the cushions that felt comforting in its simplicity. I took a sip of tea and let the warmth move through me, easing some of the tension gathered in my shoulders, and I closed my eyes for a moment, imagining her not as the infant I last held, but as the woman she must be now. I pictured her walking through her own mornings, somewhere unknown to me, perhaps carrying her own questions, dreams, and habits shaped by a life I had never witnessed. The thought wrapped around me like a bittersweet whisper, because it reminded me of how much I had missed, yet it also reminded me that time had kept her living, breathing, and growing, and that alone gave me strength. When the phone finally rang, the sound startled me so sharply that I nearly dropped my mug, and I hurried to answer it with a breath lodged in my throat. The voice on the other end belonged to the woman from the office, who spoke with a calm certainty that instantly made my pulse quicken, as she told me they had located a partial record related to the case number I had provided. Words hit me with unexpected force, and for a moment, I felt as if the room tilted slightly around me, while she explained that I needed to come in person to review the file because some information required verification. I thanked her, though my voice sounded thin to my own ears, and after hanging up, I stood there, gripping the phone tightly just to feel something solid in my hand. A swirl of emotions rose inside me so fast I could barely sort through them, and I pressed my free hand to my chest, where my heartbeat thudded loudly. I whispered a quiet prayer to the air around me, not tied to any tradition, but born from the simple hope that I could face whatever awaited me with courage. I grabbed my bag and keys with trembling hands and left the house quickly, locking the door behind me while reminding myself to breathe slowly. The drive to the office passed in a haze of shifting thoughts and whispered fears that seemed to take shape in the silence of the car. Yet beneath all of it, there was a steady determination that felt stronger than anything else. When I stepped inside the building, the familiar warmth from the heater wrapped around me again, and the same faint scent of paper and cleaning supplies nudged at my senses like a memory returning for its place. The woman at the front desk greeted me with a knowing look, and after a few moments, she handed me a thin folder that felt surprisingly heavy in my hands, as if it carried not just information, but the weight of the years I had spent searching. I thanked her quietly and walked to a small seating area where I sat down with the folder resting on my lap. And for a moment, I could not bring myself to open it, because I felt terrified of what I might find. I traced my finger along the edge of the folder and inhaled deeply, then told myself that whatever truth waited inside it was something I had the right to know, something I needed to face, because this journey was not about perfection, but about love that had survived more time than I ever expected. When I finally opened the folder, the first page showed a date I recognized immediately, the date she was born, and my breath caught painfully in my chest as I read the details beneath it. The record listed a transfer to a private facility, a name I did not recognize, and then a note that indicated she had been moved again 6 months later. Each line felt like a small piece of a puzzle I had been trying to solve my entire life, and with each word I read, I felt myself leaning closer, as if my body needed to be nearer to the truth. Near the bottom of the page was a handwritten note that looked rushed, almost messy, and though part of it had faded with time, the meaning was painfully clear. It suggested that her transfer was initiated by someone acting without proper authorization, and that detail struck me so deeply I had to blink several times to steady my vision, because the idea that she might have been taken without full consent reopened a wound that had never truly healed. I closed the folder slowly and held it against my chest as I sat there in silence, feeling the weight of everything settling inside me like a tide rising in steady, slow waves. I realized that this journey was far from over, and though I now had answers, they only whispered the beginning of a much larger story. Yet, even with the ache curling inside me, there was a spark of hope glowing quietly beneath it, and I knew I had no intention of stopping now. I left the building with the folder pressed tightly against my chest, as if holding it close might steady the tremor running through me. And when the cold air met my face, it felt sharp enough to pull me fully back into the present. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, trying to collect myself, because the information inside those pages had shaken something deep inside me, something that had been dormant for years and was now fully awake. The sky above me was a pale, muted gray, with thin streaks of light breaking through the clouds, and I watched those streaks shift as the wind moved lazily across the horizon. I drew in a slow breath and tried to steady the rise and fall of my chest, then walked toward my car with steps that felt unsteady yet determined, as if my body was learning to follow the rhythm of this new reality. Once inside the car, I set the folder on the passenger seat and rested my hands on the steering wheel, letting my forehead fall forward until it touched my knuckles. I stayed like that for several seconds while my mind replayed every line of the note, every small clue that hinted at choices made without my knowledge, choices that shaped her entire life and mine. The knowledge settled over me like a heavy blanket, yet beneath the weight, I felt a quiet fire building, a determination I had not felt this strongly in years. When I finally started the engine, I drove slowly through the neighborhood surrounding the office, not because the roads were busy, but because my thoughts were moving at a pace that demanded gentleness. I passed rows of quiet houses with trimmed lawns and small trees swaying in the wind, and for a moment, I wondered what her childhood home might have looked like, what kind of streets she might have walked, and whether she had felt safe or lonely or hopeful or lost. The questions pressed against me so heavily I felt a sting behind my eyes, and I blinked quickly, as if blinking might keep me from slipping into the sorrow waiting beneath the surface. I stopped at a small park on the way home, a place with a narrow walking path and a cluster of benches that overlooked a calm stretch of water. I parked the car and stepped outside, drawn to the quiet simplicity of the scene, because it felt like the kind of place where a heart could breathe. The wind carried the faint scent of damp leaves and soft earth, and the sound of water lapping gently against the edge of the pond filled the air with a steady rhythm that eased some of the tightness inside me. Walked to a bench and sat down with the folder resting on my lap again, and for a moment I simply stared at the water while the wind tugged lightly at my hair. The surface of the pond rippled with subtle movements, and I watched those ripples expand and fade, imagining them as the years of her life stretching outward in ways I had never been able to see. I opened the folder again and let my eyes fall on the notes, studying them with a calmness I did not feel. The details were few, but they painted a faint trail, one that suggested she had been moved through a system that left very little room for emotion or humanity. Knowing this tightened something deep inside me, yet it also sharpened my focus. Each word felt like a thread I needed to hold on to, a thread that could lead me closer to her if I refused to let it slip away. I traced the handwriting with my fingertip again, because the messiness of it made the moment feel strangely real, as if I could sense the urgency of the person who had written it all those years ago. I wondered who they had been, what they had known, and whether they had ever realized how deeply their rushed note would affect me decades later. I closed the folder and rested it against my chest once more, then leaned back on the bench and allowed my thoughts to drift to the day she was born. I remembered the sterile smell of the hospital, the way the lights had seemed too bright for my tired eyes, and the sound of her first cry, a small, fragile sound that pierced my heart with a love so fierce it frightened me. I remembered the moment I held her in my arms, and how tiny her fingers looked wrapped around mine, and the memory brought a slow ache to my throat. I whispered her name softly, because saying it out loud made her feel closer somehow, and hearing my own voice carry it into the open air felt like a small act of reclaiming something I had lost. As I sat there, the breeze picked up, brushing gently against my skin, and I took it as a quiet nudge to keep moving, to keep searching, even if the road ahead felt overwhelming. I stood slowly and walked back to the car, feeling more grounded than when I had first arrived at the park. Once inside, I placed the folder beside me again and let my fingers rest on it, as if drawing strength from the simple touch. On the drive home, the world around me felt quieter, as if everything had softened slightly to match the delicate balance inside my chest. When I reached my house, I brought the folder inside and set it on the kitchen table, then made myself a cup of tea, because I needed something warm to hold while my mind sorted through the day. I sat down slowly and wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the steam rise against my face while I stared at the folder, illuminated by the soft light above the table. I felt an odd mix of fear, hope, and exhaustion, a tangled combination that made my breath feel uneven. Yet beneath it all was a certainty I could not ignore. I was closer now, closer than I had ever been. And even though the thought scared me, it also filled me with a strength that spread through my chest like a slow, steady flame. I took a sip of tea and allowed myself to imagine the moment I might finally see her, the moment she might look at me with questions in her eyes. I knew I would tremble, I knew I would cry, and I knew I would hold on to whatever chance that moment offered. As the evening settled around me and the sky darkened outside, I leaned back in my chair and whispered into the quiet room that I was ready for whatever came next. I could not sleep that night, no matter how many times I shifted beneath the blankets or tried to calm the racing thoughts that kept circling in my mind like restless birds trapped inside a small room. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw the folder on the kitchen table glowing faintly under the soft light, as if it carried a pulse of its own. I sat up several times, pressing my palms to my face and breathing slowly until the pounding in my chest eased. Yet the moment I lay back down, the thoughts returned, weaving together memories, fears, and fragile threads of hope, until I felt the heaviness settle along my ribs like a weight I could not lift. I finally gave up trying to sleep and walked quietly into the living room, where I sat on the couch with my knees drawn close, staring at the faint outline of the furniture around me as the darkness softened the shapes into something almost tender. I felt strangely safe in the quiet, as if the silence around me understood the storm inside my chest better than anyone else could. After a while, I stood and walked into the kitchen, turning on a single lamp that cast a warm glow across the table where the folder still rested. I felt a pull toward it, a pull that felt both comforting and frightening, as if touching it again might bring me closer to her, but also open a door to truths I had not yet prepared myself to face. I sat down slowly and opened the folder, letting my eyes fall once more on the faded handwriting that had shifted the course of my entire life within seconds. I traced the letters again with the tip of my finger, imagining the hand that had written them, and wondering if that person had ever realized how deeply their small note would echo through the years. My mind drifted to all the times I had felt her absence, without fully understanding the depth of the ache. The moments when a passing child's laugh pierced me with a longing I could never quite explain. The nights when I lay awake imagining the shape of her face or the sound of her voice. I closed the folder gently and leaned back in the chair, allowing the weight of the night to settle over me in a quieter way, calmer than before. It was as if acknowledging the fear had made space for a kind of fragile courage that now sat beside it. When morning arrived, I heard the soft hum of the world waking outside, and I felt the slow shift inside myself that came with the first light of day. I stood by the window for a long moment, watching the sky brighten with shades of pale gold and muted blue, and I felt the calmness settle inside me like a fragile promise. I made myself a cup of tea and sat with it at the table, sipping slowly while I planned my next steps. I knew I needed more information, and the file had listed the name of the private facility where she had been moved when she was only 6 months old. Though it was unclear whether the place still existed, I felt a pull to go there, to stand in the space where her tiny life had been shaped without me, to look for traces of her story tucked into corners where no one had thought to look. After breakfast, I packed a small bag with essentials, not because I expected the place to be far, but because I needed to feel prepared for the unknown. I placed the folder inside my bag as gently as if it were something alive, then grabbed my keys and walked out the door with a steadiness in my steps that surprised me. The drive to the facility took longer than expected, partly because I drove slowly and partly because my thoughts wandered in ways that made me pause before turning down unfamiliar streets. When I finally arrived, I found a worn building with faded paint and boarded windows, the kind of place that looked abandoned long enough to have lost all trace of the lives that once passed through its doors. I got out of the car and walked toward the entrance, feeling the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes and the faint chill of the wind brushing against my face. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, and the silence wrapped around the building like a forgotten story waiting to be uncovered. I stood at the entrance for a moment, staring at the broken window panes and the rusted metal frame, and I felt an unexpected wave of sorrow wash through me at the thought that she might have been inside this place, held by strangers who made choices that shaped her entire life while I was somewhere else, believing I would see her again. The thought tightened something deep inside me, yet it also fueled a determination that spread through my chest like a slow awakening flame. I pushed the door open carefully and stepped inside, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the cracks. The interior was stripped almost entirely, leaving behind empty rooms with peeling paint and scattered debris. But even in the emptiness, I felt the weight of history pressing softly against the walls, the faint echo of lives who had passed through long before I arrived. I walked slowly through each room, moving with deliberate steps as if the building itself might reveal something if I approached it with enough patience. Near the back of the building, I found a small office with a broken filing cabinet tipped on its side. Papers were scattered across the floor in torn and crumpled fragments, and I knelt down to sift through them with a careful hand. Most were unreadable, either soaked by rain long ago or torn beyond recognition, but a few still held faint traces of names and dates. I gathered what I could, spreading the fragile papers across the floor and reading each line slowly. One paper listed a transfer schedule from decades ago. The dates matched the timeline in my folder. My breath caught as I traced the faded ink, hoping to find her name or anything connected to her journey. And though the pages did not directly mention her, they confirmed that the facility had indeed handled transfers like hers during that time. It felt like another thread pulling me closer to the truth, and even though the evidence was small, it was enough to make my heart beat faster with a sense of direction. I collected the papers and placed them inside my bag, then stood and looked around the room once more. I whispered a quiet promise to the empty building that I would not stop now, not after coming this far. When I walked outside again, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting a warm light across the worn exterior and illuminating the dust in the air. I stood there for a moment, letting the sunlight rest on my skin, feeling its warmth settle into the parts of me that had felt cold for far too long. I knew I had more searching to do, more questions to ask, and more paths to follow. But as I stood there taking in the quiet morning light, I felt something shift inside me. Not a sudden certainty, but a gentle, solid strength rising from a place deep within. I turned back toward my car and whispered a single sentence to myself, a sentence that felt like a vow. I am going to find her. I woke the next morning with a heaviness that felt almost physical, as if the air around me had thickened overnight and now pressed against my skin with a quiet insistence. I lay still for a moment, listening to the faint hum outside my window. trying to understand the strange tide moving inside my chest. My mind kept replaying fragments of the night before, the voices I had tried to silence, the doubts that had curled around the edges of my thoughts like a persistent shadow. I knew I had reached a point where pretending was no longer an option. The version of myself I had been holding onto was slipping, unraveling at the seams, and the more I tried to gather the pieces, the more they scattered. I got out of bed slowly and stood in front of the mirror, studying the face that stared back. The light was soft, but it did nothing to hide the exhaustion threaded beneath my eyes. I touched my fingertips to my jaw, feeling the tension locked inside it, and for a moment, I wondered if I even recognized the woman looking back at me. She carried too many stories, too many disappointments, too many moments she had swallowed instead of speaking. I brushed my hair away from my face and inhaled deeply, trying to steady myself, trying to ground the trembling that kept rising in waves. I had no plan for the day, no script to follow, but something inside me whispered that I could not keep living the way I had been. I walked into the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea. The warmth of the mug against my palms brought a strange comfort, almost like a small anchor pulling me back into the present. As the steam rose, I closed my eyes and let it wash over me, imagining it carrying away the heaviness clinging to my thoughts. I sat at the table and let my memories drift to a place I had been trying to ignore for weeks. There had been moments recently when I wanted to scream, moments when my nerves felt stretched so thin that the slightest touch could tear them apart. I had smiled through conversations even though my chest ached with things I did not know how to say. I had pushed through days that felt like walking through sand, every step slow and uncertain. I had convinced myself that resilience meant silence, that strength meant carrying everything alone. But the truth was beginning to carve itself into me with painful clarity. I was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that came from years of being the one who held everything together. The tea cooled as I sat lost in thought. I wrapped both hands around the mug even after the warmth had faded, needing the steady weight of it as if it could keep me from drifting into the familiar darkness that waited at the edges of my mind. I did not want to fall back into old patterns. I did not want to retreat into the safety of pretending. I wanted to feel something real again, something that belonged to me, something that reminded me I was still here. The urge to go outside tugged at me. I had avoided stepping out for days because the world felt too loud, too demanding, too full of expectations I could not meet. But this morning, the quiet inside me began to suffocate, and I knew I needed air. I put on a simple outfit and slipped into my shoes, each movement slow but deliberate, as if I were giving myself permission to take up space again. When I stepped outside, the air hit me with a gentle chill that woke something inside my chest. I walked without thinking, letting my feet choose the direction, letting the rhythm of my steps pull me into a kind of fragile calm. The sky above me was muted, a soft gray that carried the promise of rain, but I did not mind. There was something soothing about it, something honest about the way the clouds drifted without apology. As I walked, I thought about the conversations I had avoided, the truths I had swallowed, the dreams I had placed on a shelf because I feared what might happen if I reached for them again. I had spent so long trying to meet the expectations of others that my own voice had grown faint. I had learned to be strong for everyone except myself. A sudden gust of wind brushed against my face, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth, and I felt something twist inside me. It was small, but unmistakable. A flicker of longing for a life where I did not have to be everything for everyone. A life where I could breathe without apologizing. I walked farther until I reached a quiet place where the world felt still. I stood there, looking at nothing in particular, feeling the way my breath moved in and out of my body. For the first time in a long while, I did not rush to silence my thoughts. I let them rise. I let them speak. I let myself feel the truth of how deeply I had been hurting and how desperately I needed change. Tears slipped down my face before I even realized I was crying. They came slowly at first, then with a kind of tired urgency, as if they had been waiting for permission. I did not wipe them away. I let them fall, tasting the salt on my lips, feeling the raw honesty of it. It was not weakness. It was release. It was recognition. It was the first crack of light breaking through a wall I had built around myself. I stood there until the trembling in my chest softened, until my breath settled into a gentler rhythm, until I felt a quiet strength replace the ache. When I finally turned to walk home, something inside me felt different. Not fixed, not healed, but awake. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. I walked back home with a strange steadiness growing inside me, like something quiet but determined had finally taken root beneath my ribs, and every step felt slightly firmer than the one before it, even though the world around me looked exactly the same as it had when I left that morning. The sky hung low, heavy with unspoken rain, and the cool wind brushed against my skin in a way that made me feel awake in places I had ignored for far too long. When I reached my door, I hesitated with my hand on the handle, as if crossing the threshold meant accepting that whatever shift had happened inside me was real, and not just a momentary breath of courage that would fade once I stepped back into familiar walls. I pushed the door open slowly and walked inside, noticing the soft echo of my footsteps in the quiet room, the way the stillness seemed to watch me, waiting to see who I would be now. I sat down on the couch without turning on the lights. The dimness felt comforting, almost protective, and I let my head fall back as I breathed in the cool air settling through my home. A quiet voice inside me whispered that I had reached the point where I could no longer pretend that everything was fine just because I knew how to function. Surviving was not the same as living, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the ache of that difference in my bones. I closed my eyes and let memories surface, even the ones I usually kept buried beneath layers of distraction. I thought about the version of myself I used to imagine I would become, the woman who moved through life with a confidence that came from knowing her value rather than trying to earn it. I used to believe I would grow into her naturally, that adulthood came with some invisible instruction manual that would teach me how to stand tall, even when my world felt unsteady. But life had a way of unraveling expectations quietly, pulling threads until the picture you thought you were creating blurred and faded. I had spent years trying to force myself into shapes that pleased others, shapes that made me acceptable, shapes that minimized my needs because I had convinced myself that needing too much made me difficult. I learned how to shrink in ways that looked polite. I learned how to smile through moments that left bruises on my spirit. I learned how to be present while slowly disappearing from myself. Sitting in the dim light, I felt a wave of grief rise, not for the moments that had hurt me, but for the parts of myself I had abandoned along the way. I whispered an apology into the quiet, feeling the words tremble in my throat, as if speaking them cracked open a door inside me that had been locked for years. My chest tightened, but it was not the sharp ache I had grown used to. It was something softer, like mourning and hope tangled together. I stood and walked to the window, watching the sky shift into deeper shades of gray as the first drops of rain began to fall. The sound of it hitting the glass carried a calm rhythm that seemed to steady my breath, pulling me into a fragile peace. I placed my hand against the cool surface and let my thoughts wander to the possibility of change. Not the dramatic kind I used to dream about, but the slow, steady adjustments that rebuild a person inch by inch. I wondered what it would look like to choose myself without guilt, to speak my truth without rehearsing ways to soften it, to rest without earning it through exhaustion. The idea felt foreign, almost indulgent, but it also sparked a warmth inside me that I had not felt in a long time. I turned away from the window and walked to the small desk in the corner of the room. It had been ages since I sat there with the intention of facing myself honestly. I pulled out a notebook, its pages still crisp and untouched, and opened it to the first blank space. For a moment, I simply stared, feeling the familiar resistance rise, the instinct to hold back, the fear of seeing my truth written in ink. But then I picked up the pen and let it hover over the page. My hand trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of how much I had been carrying without speaking. When the first word finally landed on the paper, something inside me loosened. I wrote slowly at first, each sentence unraveling pieces of thoughts I had ignored for too long. The more I wrote, the more I felt myself breathe, as if the act of putting these emotions into words created space inside me that I had not realized I needed. I wrote until my hand ached and the page became crowded with everything I had kept silent. When I finally stopped, I sat back and let the truth settle around me. I felt raw, exposed, and strangely relieved, as if I had released a storm that had been gathering for years. I closed the notebook gently, treating it almost like a fragile confession that needed tenderness. The rain outside grew heavier, its steady drumming filling the room with a sound that felt both cleansing and melancholic. I wrapped a blanket around myself and sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, letting the rhythmic hum of the rain settle into my breathing. My thoughts drifted to the days ahead and how uncertain they were, but for once, the uncertainty did not scare me. It felt open, like a quiet stretch of space waiting for me to step into it without pretending to be someone I was not. I knew I still had a long way to go, that healing was not a straight line but a path full of pauses and detours. Yet something inside me whispered that I was finally ready to start walking it. I rested my head against the wall and closed my eyes, letting the sound of the rain wrap around me like a gentle reassurance. For the first time in what felt like years, I sensed a softness rising inside me, a fragile but sincere sense of possibility. It was small, but it was real, and tonight, that was enough. When I woke the next morning, the light coming through the window felt softer than usual, as if the day itself had decided to greet me gently. And for a moment, I lay still, letting the quiet warmth rest across my face while my thoughts slowly formed like ripples across calm water. My body felt different. Not lighter exactly, but more awake, more aware of the way each breath expanded my chest, as if claiming space I had long denied myself. I sat up slowly and ran my fingers through my hair, noticing the tiny ache behind my eyes that comes from crying more deeply than you intended. Yet even that ache felt strangely welcome, like proof that something inside me had finally broken open in the way it needed to. I stood and walked to the mirror, studying the lines on my face and the softness around my eyes. And for the first time in a long time, I did not see only the years I had lost, but the strength it had taken to survive them. I whispered my name out loud, letting it settle into the room, letting it feel like something I owned rather than something I had to defend. I whispered my age, too, not with sorrow or fear, but with a quiet acceptance that felt almost tender. 60 years had carved stories into my skin, some painful, some lonely, some filled with love I had forgotten to honor. And as I looked at my reflection, I realized that the woman staring back at me was not broken. She was tired, yes, but she was also ready to live differently. I made coffee and sat near the window, holding the warm mug between my hands while the world outside shifted into morning. Birds moved along the branches of the same tree I had looked at for years, but today it looked new to me, as if the light had changed the shape of everything. I took a slow sip and let my thoughts drift to my daughter, to the possibility of her, to the fragile thread that connected us after all these years. I did not know what the future held, but instead of fear, I felt a quiet determination rise inside me. Finding her had shaken something awake in me, something that now stretched through my chest like a growing root. I thought about the moment we had met, about the way her eyes had mirrored my own, about the tremble in her voice when she spoke my name for the first time. Those memories felt almost unreal, like scenes from a movie that had played too quickly for my mind to fully absorb. Yet each detail clung to me with a vividness that made my heart tighten. I wondered if she woke that morning thinking of me too. I wondered if she felt confused, overwhelmed, or hopeful. I wondered if she was afraid that I would disappear again, and the thought of that pierced me with a sharp ache that settled deep in my chest. I wanted to be careful, gentle, and patient with her, not because I feared losing her, but because she deserved the softness I had never been able to give her before. I set the mug down and reached for the notebook I had written in the night before. The pages were filled with raw truths that made my hands tremble slightly as I touched them. But instead of closing the cover, I opened to a new page and began writing again. This time, I wrote to her. I wrote about how I had searched for her long before I even knew I was searching. I wrote about the hole her absence had carved into my life, a space I tried to fill with strength, with silence, with distractions that never lasted. I wrote about my failures, my regrets, and the love that had survived every wound. I wrote about how meeting her had brought me back to myself in ways I had never expected. When I finished, I let my fingers rest against the page, imagining her reading these words one day, imagining her understanding that love does not always look graceful, but it survives even the harshest winters. I closed the notebook gently and held it to my chest, feeling the steady rhythm of my heartbeat beneath it. A quiet certainty settled over me, warm and grounding, as if my body had recognized something true before my mind fully grasped it. This was the beginning, not the end. I stood and walked outside, letting the cool air wrap around me as I stepped into the morning. The sky was a soft, pale color, the kind that makes everything feel open and possible. I walked slowly, not because my legs were weak, but because I wanted to feel each step, to honor the simple act of moving forward without rushing. As I reached the small path that led toward the woods behind my home, I felt a familiar mix of fear and courage rise inside me. I realized that every major moment of my life had begun with that mix. Meeting her had felt like that. Facing myself had felt like that. Choosing to heal would feel like that too. I paused at the edge of the path and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the morning settle around me. Leaves rustled softly in the breeze, and the air carried the faint smell of damp earth, a scent that always reminded me of beginning. When I opened my eyes again, I felt steady. I thought about calling her later in the day, about asking if we could meet again, not to rush anything, but to let her know that I was here, present and willing to move slowly if she needed time. I imagined her smile, the way her eyes had softened when she looked at me, and warmth spread through my chest until I felt it settle beneath my ribs. I walked the path until the trees opened up into a quiet clearing, a place I had always come to when my thoughts felt too heavy to carry. I sat on a smooth rock near the center and let my hands rest on my knees. The air felt cool against my skin, and a calmness moved through me like a slow tide. I thought about the long years that had shaped me, the pain that had tried to harden me, the loneliness that had tried to quiet my heart. And I realized that surviving all of it had only made the present moment more meaningful. I was not too old to begin again. I was not too late to love or be loved. My story had not ended in loss. It had led me here, to this fragile but beautiful place where healing was finally possible. As I sat there, breathing slowly, I felt a gentle certainty rise inside me, one that felt like soft sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. I whispered a promise into the still air, not loud, but steady. I promised to show up for myself. I promised to show up for her. And for the first time in many years, that promise felt like something I could keep. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more people can find a little warmth and hope in these stories too.